Hello, good evening. Welcome all for this hangout session and a Q&A session. My name is Raj Gopal. We have Dr. Sujatha Rao to talk about this quite an interesting topic, redesigning schools for the future. So we will also cover, I think somebody is asking, is it related to the ME education program? Yes, we will cover details of the ME education program at Azim Premji University with a focus on school organization, leadership and management specialization. So it is related to that specialization. But before we start taking those questions, let me first introduce Sujatha. Sujatha started her career as a management professional working with corporate organization both here in India and overseas. She then moved into the area of vocational education and training, where she was focusing mostly on structuring educational opportunities for the disadvantaged communities such as migrant groups and the indigenous population. She then worked very closely with the schools. Uh, she has worked as a consultant for various organizations on organizational restructuring, leadership development, and change management initiatives. Here at Azim Premji University, Sujatha anchors the school organization, leadership, and management specialization. She teaches many courses, education policy in school systems, which is a core course, which is part of the ME education program. Uh, she takes electives for a couple of courses like Introduction to School Leadership and Management, Managing Schools in India, and others. Uh, she's also doing a couple of research with a focus on developing a contextual understanding of educational leadership and its impact on schools. She's also involved in an in-depth longitudinal study on school leadership in Karnataka, covering a number of districts and schools in the state. And the study, which her present research is involved on a study of the government's monitoring and regulation of both government as well as private schools. The second one I'm quite interested to know here about the Sujatha is the parallel system of the research happening on the parallel system of tuitions that's relevant across the country. Sujatha, I will now request you to give a brief introduction, right, about the topic before we start answering the questions.
Thank you, Rajgopal. When we think about schools, what are schools? One way of thinking about them is that they are spaces where adults and young human beings, children, come together and create a space where educational aspirations, whatever they may be, educational intent, actually gets delivered into practice. So if you think of schools as these spaces that deal with core education, one can straight away say that they are complex spaces because education is a complex space. If we ask these questions, what is good education? What is educational purpose? What are objectives and aims? Different societies, different stakeholders have different ideas about what constitutes good and what constitutes fair education and what constitutes useful education, for example. So for some, education is deeply connected with that society and its values and beliefs. So for us, we draw our inspiration of education from our constitution and we draw our notions of good education from our curricular frameworks that talks about child friendly. It talks about developing an inquisitive and curious child. It talks also about building good citizens who contribute to society. On the other hand, for some, education could be a means of finding themselves. What is my potential? Where do I see myself in this society? How do I contribute, to the social world, to the economic world, to the ecological world? Where do I see myself in? For some others, and for many of us, education is also a way for us to position ourselves occupationally. What work do we do
Perfect.
that is meaningful, that gives us an opportunity to earn a living, and yet contributes to society? So education is also instrumental in that sense. It gives us the capabilities, the knowledge to be able to actually go into the world of work. So all of this is education.
Perfect.
And different stakeholders come into education with different objectives, different purposes, and different meaning. So if you look at schools, schools are these spaces where you have adults who are already in an occupation, teaching,
That's right.
coming into this world of schools with their own notions of what is teaching, why am I a teacher, what sort of work am I involved with, to these young human beings who are being molded and shaped in this space that we call schools. If you look at any other organization form, so if you take a factory, for instance, that's producing shoes, the factory has a clear objective. It may have different models of schools, but it is producing shoes. And a factory has the capacity to think of a standardized process by which the shoes can be manufactured, right? So I know what my input materials are going to be. I know what my factory processes are going to be. And so I know what my standard output is going to be. But even running a factory is complex because you're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with resources, you're dealing with processes. But if you think of a school where you can have multiple objectives, where there are multiple ways of reaching those objectives, and you're dealing with human beings at various levels of growth, they are, in fact, I would say, one of the most complex organizational spaces to look at. So what is this area that we are looking at? We are trying to understand and work and think about schools as organizations.
Schools as organizations.
To try and understand, are there particular ways in which schools can be structured, schools can come together, in which relationships can be formed in schools, particular forms of leadership, particular ideas of management can come together so that you create a space in which true human learning is happening. And this is learning not just for the child, who is going to spend an enormous amount of time in school, but also for adults who are in those spaces, spending 30 years, 40 years of their lives in there. So can we create those kinds of organizational forms that actually allow for that kind of human flourishing to take place? So that's the space, and that's what we are looking at and trying to work at. Yeah.
Now, before I start taking the questions, what is the size we're talking about? I didn't, until I started working for the Foundation and the university. I didn't realize the enormity what we're talking about. Because we make statements of, can we not learn from other countries? Can we not implement this?
So, I mean, we all talk about the population of India, and we throw out these 1.2 billion, etc., etc. But if you just look at schools, and if you just go with, just the DICE data, right, which is the District Information School Education data, we have close to about 1.4, 1.5 million upper primary high schools.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
And we have another 250, 300,000 higher secondary schools. And we also have a lot of schools that are unrecognized, unregistered. So while they may be unregistered from the viewpoint of administration of the government, they are still spaces where children go every day. So for us, they are also schools in that sense, right? And thousands of children go to these unrecognized and unregistered schools. So if you just put the total number of schools together, we are talking close to about 2 million schools.
2 million schools.
2 million schools, right? And if you look at an average of maybe, say, 6 teachers in a school, and I think that's a little bit, or slightly on the lower side perhaps, but even if you say 6 teachers,
12 million.
That's 12 million adults just in schools.
And we're talking only about the teachers.
And we're talking only about teachers.
12 million teachers.
And then add to that our educational system, which has numerous functionaries at the state level, at the district level, at the block level, where we have, diets, which are training institutes. We have block resource coordinators, cluster resource coordinators. We have lecturers. We have administrators. So you can see that we have 12, 13 million people involved only in school education, and I'm saying these may be conservative numbers. We could have more.
Still, it's a big number.
And 250 million children.
Children, yes, 50 million children in schools.
So there's no other institutional structure that actually deals with such a large human population. And when we say we want to reform schools, ultimately we are saying we want to reform practices in schools. We want to change teaching learning practices. We want to change the approach with which children are looked at in schools. Or we want to work in forms that are different from what we've been doing so far. Now, working with 15 million adults and 250 million children and an educational system which is typically bureaucratic in terms of its structure is going to take a lot of resources. It's going to take a lot of time, and it's also going to take a lot of different strategies to try.
Correct.
Because one strategy in a country as vast and diverse as India, with so many nuanced differences in languages, in culture, and in cultural systems, political systems, is going to take time. So it's enormous scope of work, but it's also going to be a little time consuming in terms of how it's going to happen here.
I think I'll start taking the questions now. Let's see one by one. Ankur, we just answered that question. Yes, we will talk about the MA education program later when we speak about the specialization. But it is what we're talking today is related to the MA education program here at Azim Premji University. So I think this question. Because when you say redesigning school, as a layperson, the first thing that came to my mind was infrastructure, the design part of it. I agree that, I mean, that's also important. The way I was reading an article about the height of the table and the chairs and how the classroom should be structured. That's important. But what are we talking about today?
I think it's a fair question, because the minute we say redesign, we are thinking in some way of a reconstruction of some kind. And what you are referring to is what we say BALA, right? Building as a learning aid. It becomes part of the learning experience of the child. When I'm saying redesign schools, what I am talking about is an inside-out perspective, right? How do we begin to think deeply about school cultures? So when we say school cultures, what are belief systems, what are values, what are norms that schools anchor themselves to? You see, because the way we structure our work and the way we structure relationships and the way we design processes are all deeply linked to our belief systems. So for example, if I strongly believed that teachers require supervision at work, I believe, if I believe
at work, right?
Yeah, if I believe that teachers are not very competent, right? But I do need teachers in the classroom, but I need supervision of teachers. If this is my belief system, the processes that I'm going to put in place are going to do two things. One, it's going to make sure that because I feel and I believe that my teachers are not very competent, I'm going to have processes that actually says, even if a teacher is not very competent, the system is going to run, right? So I may standardize everything from the moment the teacher enters the classroom to the time that the teacher leaves the classroom. His or her work is structured. So that's one way in which my belief system drives my process. I may also believe that teachers will not work if I don't supervise them, in which case I will have elaborate systems of inspection to ensure that teachers are working. So I would make sure that I check my teacher's attendance record. I will see what time the teacher enters the classroom, what time the teacher leaves the classroom. I may have an inspectorial system inspecting my teacher's attendance record. So it's a system that I put into place because of a particular belief system. So part of redesigning the school is to begin to understand what is the identity of the school, right? What does it see itself as? And can we think of schools differently? Can we begin to redesign the way that school elements are structured together? The way that school processes come together. So when we're talking about redesign here, we're saying, can we leave aside a particular way of thinking about schools. Certainly, schools will have buildings. I mean, if it's not a building like this, it may have an open environment. It may have, smaller tables rather than larger tables. We may move away from chalk and talk, much more towards technology. We may have multiple learning materials available. But all of this also needs to be anchored to why we are doing what we are doing. So the redesign is really the why question, right? Why are we doing what we are doing? Yeah.
And you said about the processes as well. Right? So you said about the factory, the shoe factory, then also, do we look at the today's education system more of a factory model of standardized processes inside?
Right.
And how do we see that? What should we change?
Right.
What are your views?
Right. I think someone just asked us that question as well about the industrial age system of education.
I think I'll pick that. Yeah. So we are actually answering a lot of questions here at the same time, but I'll pick this. Yeah, I think that's Fazal's question.
It says the industrial system of education has spread around the world in the past few years. Will it change dramatically in the coming decade? Few institutions are more immune to innovation than the public education system. The idea of the bureaucracy, right, that emerged with Weber, we're going back to the 1910s, 1920s, almost 100 odd years back. Weber made a very interesting point when he said that the bureaucratic system, once established, is a self-sustaining system. Right? Human beings will come and go, but once the structure of the bureaucracy is established, once you have the roles established, once you have the criteria by which the roles will be populated, once you know who's accountable to whom, what is your span of control, then human beings in many ways become replaceable. Most large systems run on a bureaucratic model, partly because a bureaucratic system is efficient. There is a sense of objectivity about the bureaucratic system. While at the one level you say that it ignores the human being, on the other hand, the bureaucratic system will also say we treat all human beings equal. I will not indulge in partiality or nepotism. I will look at the best person for the job, whether you come or whether the Prime Minister comes, we treat every individual the same, so on and so forth. So there is a rationality about the bureaucratic system. And it works when you have large complex systems to deal with, right? Now, unfortunately, the mass education system has taken on a factory mode. Because of the sheer numbers that we talked about, 250 million children, for example, in India that we're looking at, is there an alternative way of thinking about schools that is not within the bureaucratic system, right? Which is the movement away from the factory. Now, if you look at the factory system, we can think of a factory almost like an egg crate. You open an egg crate and you see these identical 6, 7, 12 cubes, right, or spaces. We can think of schools like that. In some sense, you take a school in India, you take a school, for example, in Bangalore city, you go to a place like Chhattisgarh, or you go to a place like Haryana, and if I take and present to you pictures of classrooms, everybody will say this is a school. Because they are, in some sense, what we call isomorphic. They tend to resemble each other. And the resemblance is the factory system, right? The egg crate system. But with education and with schools, human beings are individual. They are so unique.
Completely agree, yeah.
And we are not making these shoes in a factory. We are developing human potential. And how does human potential then flourish? Maybe a different metaphor for us to think of is a movement away from the industrial factory to perhaps the farm. Right? So let's relook at it, right? So if you think of a farm, right, a garden or a farm space, we know that to a large extent the farmer is deeply concerned about what he or she is growing in the farm, right? So the farmer is aware of what is my soil, what is the weather patterns I'm dealing with, how do I sow, when do I sow, What resources do I need for sowing?
Fantastic, yeah.
What sort of weeds grow with a plant, right? So if I'm growing rice, I might have another plant, a natural plant that, sort of make sure that there are no rodents that come and, eat your rice. These are natural enough.
Correct.
And a farmer knows this because a farmer comes to the farm from a perspective of care. I care for my plants and I want them to grow. Now, if you think of a farm system, we have large farms around the world, right? And growing hectares and hectares of different crops. But it would be impossible for us to think of a farm that is being standardized and controlled at the level of the ministry. The ministry is not going to come to each farmer and say, today you must grow ragi, tomorrow you will grow rice. This is your growth plan, right? What the ministry would do would say, here are resources for you to use because you know the context best in which you are growing. So to a large extent, farming is decentralized. Of course, farmers need support. Of course, farmers need knowledge. Of course, farmers need professional development. Of course, farmers need community, stakeholders to work with them. But to a large extent, there is also autonomy there because there is a recognition that farming is, plants are unique, flowers are unique, what I'm growing is unique. So the factory to farm metaphor maybe helps us a little bit to think about the extent to which the industrial model can take root, and why shaking that industrial model requires thinking of the organization, because I cannot shake an institution unless I begin to ask, what is the belief systems here? What is the culture here? How is it structured? Can I think of an alternate way of structuring it, right? Even when it comes to leadership, for example. Many people assume that when we use the word leader or leadership, we are talking about a command and control model, right? That we have this charismatic leader on top. The leader will decide. The leader then provides directions, and you have these followers. Right? In a school system, one can ask, who are the leaders? Who has, instead of asking who's leading, suppose we ask who has influencing capacity in a school. I'm sure everybody would say, well, teachers have influencing capacity, tremendous, in the classroom, outside the classroom. Children have influencing capacity.
I think that's one question, yeah.
Right? Administrators have influencing capacity. But if we go in with our command and control model, that there is a singular leader, the leader is going to lead us out into a utopian world, it actually is problematic. So thinking of different models of leadership, right? Far more distributed, far more democratic, far more collegial, actually brings us back to the farm model, where the farmer is far more, thinking about it as in a more collegial kind of an activity. So,
good. Thank you. Thanks. So, Fazal, hope that answers the question. I'm going to take two questions, Sujatha, here. So, question is, what is true education?
Yes.
Right. And the next is, Radhika will probably answer, but we'll pick that. How can we include students or the learner, whom she calls the important stakeholder in the school system, in this process of redesigning? So, if you could combine those two and then answer.
I think part of the way in which schools get to be redesigned is beginning to think about what these spaces are. You see, whenever we create an organization, our fundamental sort of questions are, who are our stakeholders? What do our stakeholders want? How do we provide what our stakeholders want effectively and efficiently? And what is this broader purpose for which we are all working towards, right? Schools, apart from being this, working towards this objective and thinking of these stakeholders, are also moral institutions. When we say moral institutions, here I'm not talking about it being religious in any way, but I'm saying that school's purpose is driven by something far more ethical, right? Because we are dealing with children and they are flourishing. So if we begin to ask that fundamental question, who are the stakeholders in our school? Our primary stakeholder is the child. Everything that the education system does, including the hiring of teachers, is for the child. And yet, if you go back to our factory idea, the product in a factory system is the outcome of your process. And if we take that model, the child is the outcome of the education system. So in that sense, the child loses all its agency in the school system, right? But if we drop that model and we begin to say that everything that we do is for the child, then without the child's voice in the school, no redesign is possible, right? So a good way of thinking about it, and someone has asked, are there tools to look at it? A very good way of thinking about it is actually to understand what a child needs and how can a school become responsive to the child's need. For example, one can redesign an entire school based on the notion of well-being.
Notion of well-being,
right? So yes, we all know that schools are academic institutions and that learning is going to happen there. And for millions of students, that learning culminates in a examination, either a 10th or a 12th board examination. But if we leave that aside, children spend enormous hours in schools, right? And we were just discussing, there is a study, right, many years back that suggested that children spend about 15 to 16,000 hours of their life in a school. How much of impact does 16,000 hours have on a human being? If we say that the primary purpose of the school is the child's well-being, in which academic well-being is one, but not all. I have emotional well-being, I have physical well-being, I have spiritual well-being, I'm looking at the socio-emotional well-being of the child, then perhaps my starting plot for designing the school may be a medical and a counseling center. I may not start with a timetable, right?
Not worrying too much about the academic part of it, but first.
Perhaps now, I might say physical well-being for the child, I need to think of a robust physical activity program for my child. But I also need to make sure that the child is safe. I need to make sure that there's no bullying in the school. So a central way of redesigning the school may be from a discussion of what are social relationships? How do we relate to each other as a human being so that we each feel safe and secure in a school? Now, this has nothing to do with designing my lesson plan, although I may talk about this in my lesson plan, but my redesign comes from a different place, right? So I completely agree there. I think that bringing the child as the crux, the heart of the why we are doing what we are doing, allows us to recognize the needs of the child first, and then the restructuring then becomes a process by which we are aiding that. We are moving towards that.
Thank you, thanks, Sujatha. I think now I was just remembering when we spoke last week with Indra on the curriculum and pedagogy specialization, which is part of the MA education program here. She referred it to as the heart.
Yes.
Curriculum and pedagogy being the heart of when we're talking about education. So where do you now put schools?
I completely agree. Actually,
also talk about how our specialization.
Yes. I actually completely agree in sense with what Indra said about it being the heart, right? Because teaching and learning is what education in some sense is about. So curriculum and pedagogy is that, if you look at it, the circulatory system, right? That's in a sense keeping the whole thing alive. But we can think of schools and school organization, leadership and management, in a sense as the skeletal and the neurological system, right? So without getting too much into human anatomy, the very act of teaching and learning happens within structured spaces. When we talk about schools, of course, learning and teaching is a lifelong experience, right? As human beings and as children, we learn everywhere. We learn outside of schools, we learn in our families, we learn in our communities. But if you take that informal learning space out and you say, where does a child learn? That structure is the school. And the school provides in many ways also structured opportunities for the child to engage with subject matters, whether you're doing mathematics or science. It allows the child to engage with its conceptual development in a structured way. It also provides for a structure by which one human being encounters another human being, right? So when we put a child in a classroom, for example, and we say this is section A and that's section B, section A and section B consists of 20 other human beings who are going to form these relationships with each other. So in many ways, you can think of it as a structuring mechanism. You can also think of schools as the center where decision making happens. So if you look at our neurological system, that's our decision making system. We respond, we make choices, and we react. So schools do it all the time. So typical example, right? So when a student comes to a school for admission, schools make choices about whether they decide whether to accept the child or not accept the child. This is a decision making activity of the school. How do schools decide that? Well, schools may say, I want to have an entrance exam, or I might want to talk to parents, or I will interact with the child. But it's a decision making activity that is driven by management and leadership ideas and values, right? When we decide that we will have, when the child comes to class 8 or class 9, all extracurricular activities are dropped, and we will focus on academics. It's a decision within the school, So these educational aspirations that we have get translated as everyday decisions in school. It gets translated in the school structure. It gets translated into the way that teachers are assigned classes to teach. One teacher will teach 5 subjects or four classes. Which child will interact with which child? How do I group a child when I'm doing multi-level? All of these decisions are formal structure. So one could think of schools as sort of skeletal, right? Neurological, yeah. You asked about the specialization.
Yeah, just hear about the how the school structure, what we're talking about, how does it fit in the ME education program here at Azim Premji University, and how is this linked to the specialization?
Right. So within the MA education program broadly, we develop an understanding of the context in which our schools are working. So we have a lot of core courses that deals with what we call the educational intent, right? So policies and programs. We've got the Right to Education Act now. We've got large programs in our country like the Sarva Shiksha programs, 8-level policies that are particularly focused on educational outcomes. So we have this policy world and program world that we have to understand, and that becomes important as much as we understand the history of our school systems, the history of education, and we deal with sociology and child development and learning and philosophy of education. So these form core aspects. In the second year, I think as some of the faculty have already mentioned, there is an opportunity to specialize. And the specialization which we have is the school organization, leadership and management specialization. And I think perhaps we might be the only program in the country that does such a specialization, where we deal with core issues about ideas, models and theories of organizations, ideas, models and theories of leadership. So do we look at managerial forms or distributed forms or participatory forms, right? What ways of leadership can we think about? And what are some methods and ideas that one can use to manage schools? So for example, can one think of an organizational development approach to manage schools? That's one theory that we look at. I think it's also important that we recognize that when we say a master's in education, sometimes people assume that this is working only with children, right? That it's just yes, what we do is for children, but a master's in education also requires that you work with adults because you have a huge number of adults working in education for children. So the specialization also looks at issues of adult learning, right? How do adults change? How do they begin to change their practices? How can educational systems change? So we have a systems way of looking at education. So broadly, the specialization does not focus very much on classroom pedagogy and curriculum, but it deals with, in a sense, everything that happens outside of that influences the classroom learning and teaching.
And when you say leadership and management, it sounds very MBA kind of environment. How do you see this within the framework? I think you explained that, but is it more about the individual professional development that we're talking about, or the processes around it? How do you differentiate?
Right. Yeah. I think part of this, the idea, when we use the word management and leadership, sometimes it sounds awkward when we put it along with education, partly because they've emerged in fields that are not pure education, right? So they have emerged from what we would call organizational studies or management studies or leadership studies. But if we begin to rethink of what education, in our country requires, these become important to think about, because often we work under assumptions that there is, when we use the word management, it means only one thing, which is planning, organizing, coordinating, controlling, leading, the traditional ideas. We've moved a long way from that, right? So today, when we talk about management, we talk about, for example, critical management studies that actually questions ideas of power in schools. Now, no education discourse can be done unless one actually begins to question power, right? Who has authority over what, including what you're teaching and how you're teaching, right? When we talk about management, about this notion of an effective school. Schools consume a lot of resources, whether they are human resources, material resources, financial resources. And every year when our annual, our financial budget comes, we look to see what is our educational outlay, right? And we are concerned that our educational outlay is only 3.5% or 3%, whereas our defense outlays are 4 times that. But tremendous amount of resources have gone into teacher salaries, for example. I think 80-85% of our educational budget is teacher salary. Now, how do these resources, in some sense, make sense for the school? So how does a school become effective? Which brings us back to our first question about what are the objectives of a school and how does a school manage multiple stakeholders and their interests. So that's management in some sense. How do we manage these schools? And when we're talking about leadership, I think if we recognize that schools are democratic spaces where multiple stakeholders have multiple needs, then leadership necessarily moves away from being controlled. You cannot, however much you want to, you cannot control what the teacher does in the classroom. Teaching is still a very private activity, so what goes behind the classroom is known only to the teacher and the student. So however much you may want to put a control structure there, it's not going to work. So can we think of alternate ideas of leadership? So that's how we have thought about it. And we very much want to look at it from a system perspective. We want to take interconnections between elements, see how they work together. And we want to understand it also in the context of education being spaces where adults work, so not just children. So policy, context, and then organizational and leadership.
That's right. So before I think there's some question coming about designing, if it's possible, every sector. It is, before I take that question, how is the field work designed for this specialization, so that we can talk about?
I think all our MA education, our entire MA education program has been conceptualized very much by looking at theory and practice as interlinked, right? So not theory and practice, but theory and practice together, praxis in some sense. So we have weekly practicums, whether a student is doing a general track, which is also a very useful approach to sort of look at an MA education program, or whether a student is doing a specialization. Every student has 1 day a week allocated for practicum. Within the SOLM specialization, a lot of our practicum work is in schools.
Right.
So we go there and, for example, we may try and understand the life of a school head teacher. Right? We may try and, yes. The school head teacher is a very invisible role in our public education system. In private school, we have school principals, but their lives can be very challenging. Multiple tasks sort of compressed together in a single day. So a very fragmented work life they have. So practicum could include understanding the role of a head teacher, could be looking at challenges, constraints that school principals face. It could be looking at how a school is structured. It could be looking at how our school process is coming together. It could be looking at teacher-teacher relationship, teacher-principal relationships. So a lot of our work is in schools, but we also do work in practicum outside of schools. So this could be attending workshops on understanding how change practice happens. It could be working with facilitating adult learning. It
Okay,
could
right.
it could be working with, let's say, the block or the district institute where we understand how the DEO's office work. So if we keep that broader picture of policy, adults, understanding schools, then our practicum exposure works with all of that. Apart from that, we have the 6 week field internship, and students of the specialization choose an area within this to do their 6 week internship.
Okay.
So we've had students, for example, who've gone and worked with organizations who have designed leadership development programs for head teachers
Okay.
and school principals. So they've actually participated in the design of a program. We've had students who participated in facilitating such programs. We've had students who've gone and done very in-depth school level, almost ethnographic work in schools, trying to understand what leadership practices are emerging in our schools. How are they different from maybe Western ideas of leadership? We've had students gone and looked at school management committees. We have mandated SMC committees in our public school system. So how do SMCs work? The practicum is very important. The field work is what allows you to explore ideas. It allows you to take theories and put it into practice, and it's, I think, one of the best part of the program.
Thanks. So we have 15 more minutes to go. Let me just take the questions. We might have answered some of them. So Wade is asking what is the student-teacher ratio in Indian schools? So that's quite.
It's one of the most difficult questions to answer because it's impossible to generalize in our public school systems, right? We have single teacher schools where a single teacher may actually just handle 15 students, right? Or 20 students. So the PTR looks good, 20:1. But a single teacher is handling classes 1 to 5. So we have single teacher schools. We have schools where the PTR ratio could be 1:20, 1:25. We have schools in which the PTR ratio is 1:50, 1:60. Part of the problem is because our schools are so diverse. So if you say government schools alone consist of Kendriya Vidyalaya schools. They consist of Navodaya schools, Sainik schools. We have tribal schools. We have municipal schools in which the PTR ratios are so different. Very difficult to answer it. Although RTE gives us a sense, right? It's sort of hinting at a 1:30 ratio, and I think most schools are aiming for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see. I think, Ankur, we answered a question about the tools for redesigning the schools. You did answer. Afil Rahman, you may have to rephrase your question. I didn't quite understand. I think you're talking about future education. Redesigning, is it possible in every sector related with education? Is he talking about vocation? I'm just making a guess here.
Yeah. So we are, of course, talking about the formal school systems, right? Education doesn't begin or end there. As we move from formal school systems, we encounter higher education. We have a lot of structural problems there because we know that our student dropout rates, we are very much a pyramid. And so we have a lot of student dropouts happening as children move into higher classes. Sometimes they are active dropouts, so they just exit the school system. Sometimes they're passive dropouts. They're in school, but they've checked out. They're just there. And once you finish that, you move into higher education, where you have vocational education coming in, and then you have sort of university, colleges, etc. But along with this, we also have a parallel unregulated system, right? Which is that a child's learning doesn't begin and end in schools. They go for private tutoring, supplementary classes, online tutoring, face-to-face, endless array of structured teaching, which is a parallel shadow system that exists along with our formal school system. So, I mean, what we are discussing to a certain extent is what we can do with the formal system, right? How can we create these spaces that are much more, attuned to the child and what children are looking for. But these structural changes are quite massive, right? So one might say that if we begin to think about reforming our examination system, for example, many commentators believe that, or many academics believe that a great way of reforming the system is to reform your examination system. because a lot of what you're doing is catering to that examination system, right? Including our vast supplementary tutoring system. So if we reform examination, will schools change? Possibly. Uh, but in its entirety, schools would also have to, change considering all the other educational aspirations. So I don't know whether that was the exact question that
Yeah,
he was
we'll request
asking. But,
Hapil to rephrase the question. If you need to ask, we'll be happy to take your question again, Hapil Rahman. Uh, that reminds me, Sujatha, where are you seeing, what are the career opportunities
yeah,
for students who decide to go for this specialization?
yeah. So the scope, just like for our MA education program, is a fairly broad scope. Organization look for generalists who also have an understanding
That's
of
correct.
school organization, leadership, and management, and they also look for specialists. So where have our students gone? Our students have gone into working with teacher educators.
Okay.
So they've gone and worked in terms of developing programs for school heads. So program designers, curriculum designers for school leaders, principals, etc. They have gone and looked at program management work. So you're designing and managing programs. We've had people who have looked at and gone and worked in schools, school coordinators, school administrators, working with school coordinators and school administrators. We've also had people who've gone and worked as school teachers.
Interesting.
We've had students who have gone into higher education, right? So they've also done a course like this and then gone on to look at a specialized program, maybe a doctoral or a higher master's in educational leadership, a PhD program in educational leadership.
Oh, that's nice. Okay. So there is opportunities of higher education as well after this.
Yes. So, I mean, we are a liberal program. And so a liberal program, our idea is to provide a broad spaced understanding and really develop a more reflective practitioner. And the spaces are quite varied in what can be done.
Yeah, the one question which I want to ask, I forgot to ask was, Sujatha, I know when you say redesigning the school, you're talking about systems and processes, but will you see technology playing a role? Now it's everything is about
Yeah.
digitizing and to give a pad or computer or any device to the child. And what do you see that?
Um, so if we think of technology as something that enables the teaching and learning process, rather than technology, in a sense, leading the teaching and learning process, right? So we sometimes hear this about a teacherless classroom, for example, right, where everything is driven by the technology and the student and the smart board or the tablet, etc., etc. I think they're problematic if you look at technology as the solution to all of the challenges within schools. And certainly, when we are redesigning a school, one has to ask the question, what are all those enabling ways in which teachers, students, and the school space come together?
Right.
In which technology can be one, right? So, in today's world, I mean, very young children encounter technology very fast. And many of them encounter technologies faster than the teachers have. Which actually creates, in some ways, a power imbalance in the classroom. The child knows more about the technology than the teacher. But if we look at what is the culture of a school, do we see, for example, a tree and as a technology as well of learning, as we do a tablet, then technology need not be an either or answer. If you look at technology in that true sense of materials that allow for learning to happen, content, processes that allow learning to happen, and technology can be very useful in schools, right? As long as we understand why we are doing what we are doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Sanjay, I don't know why premier institutes. I mean, I don't know whether this which institutes you're talking about. Why institutes focus more on theories in place of practice? That's definitely not the case here. I think Sujatha, you did answer about the. Probably somebody was. I think when I came in here, I asked why is this not education studies and education?
Right. I think there is a great value in understanding theories. Theories are what many people before us have gone into the world of practice and deciphered, in some sense, ways for us to think about things, right? They've given us frames of reference, right? They've generalized findings and they've given it to us to say, I have done this and this has worked and this is why I think it works, right? I think it's important to understand that, because otherwise we always go only with intuition. This works for me, it may or may not work for you. Having said that, I think there is no way one can really understand theory unless you go back and see what it means in practice.
Absolutely.
And we take practice and we go back to theory and say it has to be reformed. So there's a conversation that happens between theory and practice. And I think in our MA education program, we really want to drive that. And I think all faculty within APU, I think, come predominantly from that perspective. We have a wide range of faculty. We have academics, we have practitioners, and we come together with that mindset. So I think theory has its place. It's important, as important as practice.
So someone told me theory, what you're learning is concise. Practice. And that's what I do.
Right. So someone would refer to it as abstractions of the truth, right? So you go now and you check the truth, the models.
Right. We have 5 more minutes to go. Yeah, thanks for the questions that's coming in. But if you still need to ask the question, join the Hangout window, and there's a green button on the right side. Click Ask a New Question, and we'll be happy to take that. Ankur, just taking a question about, I think you're asking about the pay package. We decided not to declare or announce the pay packages that our students get, but I can clearly tell you the starting salary that's been offered is anywhere between 20,000 to 30,000 per month. That's there on our, if you go to our website, we have declared, and there are a lot of well-meaning organizations, and the issue is not about payment. It's about finding the right candidate with the right attitude and knowledge for work. Okay, so don't compare with it. It is much beyond engineering or management. It's all about the interest, the passion you have to work in this sector. It's a difficult area to work with. I'm telling you, with having worked in both the corporate world and the social sector, this sector probably need much more competent people. Much more, yes, much more.
As much
as for a corporate job that an engineer or a management professional would do. Okay, and Sujatha, you said about the research that what you're doing. So it is interesting that private tuition that's happening. What are the theoretical frameworks that you're using for your research?
So, I mean, my background is in organizational studies. So I am interested actually in looking at these broader institutions that are running parallel to each other, right?
Okay.
So if you look at it, even as we talk about reforming our education system, we are talking about reforming our formal education system. But our the supplementary, or what you call the shadow education system, is completely unregulated, right? It is private. It doesn't come under the Department of Education or the Ministry of Human Resource and Development. It's not on the concurrent list, so central and state really don't bother about it. But they have tremendous influences on the child. And it has tremendous influence on teaching and learning practices.
Right.
It has a tremendous influence on what you call content and curriculum and pedagogy, right? So if one needs to understand one system and see how it's influencing another system, it's important to take institutional perspectives, right? So a lot of my work comes from what's called institutional theory. And institutional theory really looks at this whole array of meaning making and structures and network of actors that work with one another to actually create what you call institutionalized practices, practices that are almost taken for granted. And one wonders why it's there, but then you answer it's always been there. But there are ways in which it has become an always there occurrence, So something like marriage, right? It's an institutionalized practice, but there are actors who prop that institution up together. So institutional theory gives us a way of understanding the field, the connection of actors that together make meaning and sense of things and create rules. So just like we have football rules or cricket rules, we have rules of the field. So who are these actors who create these rules, right? So we have a rule that says a child coming into school exits the school only after an examination system, right? That's a rule. Who's created these rules? And so for me, this particular study is really looking at our formal regulated system and the shadow system, to actually ask questions about how each is influencing the other and what sort of actors together make these rules that we're all playing by. So
very interesting. Very interesting. Sujatha, thank you very much for the session.
Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you all for watching this talk. If you have any questions, please do email us at admissions@apu.edu.in. We are both on Facebook and Twitter. Please do go to those pages if you want to get updates about our events and programs. We'll be back again next week. We are doing a session on early childhood education. Till then, goodbye and good luck.